Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's conversation. We're going to give it about 30 more seconds or so just to allow others to join. All right, thanks everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's conversation. It's today's National HoUSed campaign call for universal, stable, and affordable housing. My name is Renee Willis. I'm the Vice President for Field and Communications with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and I'll be facilitating today's conversation. So today, on today's call, we'll focus on the expiration of the CDC eviction moratorium, and immediate federal, state, and local actions needed to protect renters. We'll also focus on the week ahead for the reconciliation package and the HoUSed campaign priorities. We will discuss how people can get involved and take action on both protecting low-income renters at risk of eviction and advancing the HoUSed campaign priorities in the reconciliation bill. We'll be joined today by Tim Thomas, PhD from UC Berkeley, who will discuss a new housing precarity risk model. We'll also get the latest from NLIHC's Erase project, and we'll share the latest updates from Capitol Hill and hear from the field team and more. So today's webinar is being recorded, so we'll make sure it will be recorded and made available after the broadcast. You'll be able to find the recording on our website at www.nlihc.org/housed. And as time permits, we'll take a few questions. If you have questions of any of the speakers, please use the Q&A function that should be at the bottom of your screen. So let's start first. I want to introduce Sarah Sadion and also Sarah Gallagher. Sarah Sadion is the coalition's Vice President of Policy, and Sarah Gallagher is the Senior Project Director of Erase, which stands for End Rental Arrears to Stop Evictions. And today they're going to talk to us about the expiration of the moratorium and urgent federal, state, and local actions that are now needed. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much. A lot to cover given the end of the moratorium. So I want to give you a brief synopsis of all of the goings on in Congress and on Capitol Hill over the past couple of days, and to share with you where things are right now. So 2 days before the federal eviction moratorium was set to expire, the president put out a statement announcing that he did not plan to extend the moratorium further. And that was deeply concerning. And at the same time, really explained why he wasn't able to do that and pushed the buck to Congress to step in. So he said he wasn't able to do that because of the threat from the Supreme Court. I know we've talked on past calls before about how there's a lot of indications that the Supreme Court could overrule an eviction moratorium and invalidate it. And that because so many court cases have already moved through the process, that sort of an action could happen pretty quickly and would leave renters without the protections that we're seeking to have. And so instead, he called on Congress to pass legislatively an extension to the eviction moratorium. But it was just 1 day before the House was set to take recess for the August recess. So that set off a very robust and intense effort from House Financial Services Committee Chairwoman Maxine Waters and Speaker Pelosi and others to extend the moratorium through legislation that would provide that protection to renters through the end of December. Our staff worked really closely with congressional champions, trying to whip the votes that were necessary to get that bill through the House floor. But ultimately, we weren't successful. From what we've heard, there were about 12 to 14 House members who held out and wouldn't vote for the bill, either because the proposal that was on the table went too long, in their opinion, by going through the end of December, or because they think, okay, it's just time for the moratorium to end. It's not a long-term solution. Let's focus on emergency rental assistance. But either way, we didn't have the votes. And so instead, Speaker Pelosi brought the bill to the floor seeking unanimous consent, which would have allowed the bill to move forward if everyone agrees. But of course, we know Republicans aren't going to support this extension of the moratorium. They objected, and the bill died, and the House went into recess. I will say, since then, we've seen a lot of outcry from especially progressive members of Congress who are calling on further action. I wanted to just highlight the incredible work from Congresswoman Cori Bush, who issued a very powerful statement to her colleagues in the House, drawing on her personal experience with eviction and homelessness. She has been sleeping outside of the Capitol on the Capitol steps to bring attention to the issue and to put more pressure on Congress to pass Maxine Waters' bill. If you haven't been following her on Twitter or have read her statement, I encourage you to do it. It's really powerful. And other members of Congress were following suit. We saw Senator Elizabeth Warren speak on the Senate floor. Pelosi sent out a really heartfelt note to her colleagues, again, citing the moral and ethical need to act. But ultimately, it is not able to pass on the House floor. We also know that even if the House was able to pass, we've talked about before how there's this huge uphill battle in the Senate. We had done some outreach to moderate Republicans last week when it looked like there might have been this path forward in the House, and it was immediately shut down by moderate Republicans not interested in extending the moratorium. So certainly we knew it was very unlikely to pass an extension legislatively, and that was reaffirmed over the last week. So what has happened since? Well, we know that the moratorium did expire over the weekend. There are 6.5 million households who are behind on their rent and who are already starting to see eviction notices and move through the eviction process. Many of these households are in communities that have a really high risk of COVID infection. In fact, 80% are located in communities where there are spikes in COVID cases. And at the same time, only $3 billion of the $46 billion that Congress provided in emergency rental assistance has actually been spent as of the end of June. So we're in a very difficult place when it comes to the federal level. In light of the real difficulty here in getting an eviction moratorium extended at the national level, we've been engaging with the Biden administration on other actions that they need to take to protect renters. And so as soon as the Biden administration announced that they weren't going to extend the moratorium, we sent a letter with our partners at the National Housing Law Project. I'm going to share a link to that letter in the chat box about other really important actions that they should be taking, especially in light of the fact that they weren't going to extend the moratorium. So for example, calling on the Biden administration to immediately announce an eviction moratorium for all renters living in federally assisted housing. So for households living in HUD, USDA, or low-income housing tax credit properties, the federal government has the authority and should be using it to institute their own eviction moratorium and to require those owners or public housing agencies to apply for emergency rental assistance before evicting renters and only using eviction as a last option. We also have been encouraging them to look into what sorts of authority the Federal Housing Finance Agency might have to extend similar protections or eviction moratoriums on federally backed mortgages, encouraging the Department of Justice to be issuing a notice to state courts declaring that evictions still have health implications, and therefore heightened safeguards are needed, including pre-trial discovery, access to legal representation, and longer notice terms, encouraging courts to work with emergency rental assistance programs to really prioritize those renters who are most at risk. And we've asked the CDC, knowing that they weren't going to extend the eviction moratorium, to at least require that landlords or courts provide a 30-day notice period to renters before they're able to proceed with an eviction. There are some additional things that we've been pushing the Biden administration to do specific to the emergency rental assistance program. We've been advocating for them to create a safe harbor provision that would explicitly give assurances to state and local programs that as long as they are interpreting guidance reasonably, that the administration won't claw back those funds. We've heard from a lot of program administrators that they're worried that if they're later found to not be in compliance with program rules, that they'll have to repay that money. And we want to really give license to programs to move as quickly as possible to get resources out to those who need it. Other changes in the ERA program that we've been thinking about and encouraging is essentially using the flexibility that we see in other Treasury dollars to minimize the sort of documentation that would be required. So for example, the state and local fiscal relief funds that Congress also passed in the American Rescue Plan allows state and local governments to just presume that anybody who is low or moderate income had a COVID hardship. And we think they should be able to do the same thing here with this program, especially as we get further and further out from the real most urgent economic challenges from the pandemic. There's some other things we're encouraging, as we always have been, which is requiring or directing programs to simplify their applications and to work with renters who have incomplete applications so that they can get those resources, and raising awareness through an all-of-government approach, including other federal agencies that have direct ways of communicating with low-income renters or low-income households who might be in need. We're hearing that it is making a difference. The pressure that all of us are putting on the Biden administration to act, they are hearing that, especially given the events of the last week in Congress over efforts to extend the eviction moratorium. They're starting to hear a lot of really frustrated voices from members of Congress about the slow pace of spending. So I expect to hear something soon from congressional offices and from the Biden administration about ways to help expedite those dollars. For now, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Sarah Gallagher, who's going to share about some of the things that we're asking state and local governments to be doing right now.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, so much for that really comprehensive overview and update where we are. So as Sarah mentioned, and as I've been watching the chat go through, in addition to what we're seeing as continued needed federal action, now is really the time where we're turning some of our focus to immediate state and local actions that need to be taken now that the administration had failed to extend the eviction moratorium. So I'm going to go over a couple of both state and local actions, as well as some program administrator actions. And Renee, I did have a few slides. If you can pull them up, great. If not, I'll just go on without them. So for state and local programs, there's three areas where we are asking folks to focus. One is really creating or extending some of the state and local eviction moratoriums that have been implemented already. We already talked about the newly surging Delta variant, low vaccination rates in communities with high eviction filings, and the slow rate of distribution have really made these state and local moratorium and extensions very clearly needed. If you're going to be pursuing state and local moratoriums, it's very important that these renter protections should extend until vaccination rates increase in communities that are most at risk of eviction, as well as allowing some time for the local governments and states to ramp up their efforts to distribute emergency rental assistance more quickly. The second area, which is clear, is that we need to really ramp up and quickly distribute emergency rental assistance. At the end of June, only $3 billion of the $46 billion in emergency rental assistance funds provided had been spent. And while some states are really making significant progress and we're seeing the trend ramp up, it's not fast enough, and with the end of the moratorium, it needs to be even faster. Later in the call, a couple of colleagues of mine, Rebecca and Emma, will talk about some of the key components that will help to ramp up that spending as quickly as possible. And then the third area here is really enacting additional renter protections. We really need to start to look at other measures such as right to counsel, expungement of eviction records, and just cause eviction standards that can really help protect renters now as well as in the long term. So working with your state legislature to enact additional rental protections as soon as possible is extremely important. So next, when in addition to state and local actions, ERA programs can really do a few things in the here and now that will have really immense impact on landlords and households most at needs. So with the possibility of state and local courts processing or hearing a greater number of eviction cases with a moratorium no longer in existence, it's crucial that attorneys, judges, justice of the peace, court staff, and others are all active partners in connecting landlords and tenants to the assistance they need. We really need to start looking at improving access through state and local courts and creating partnerships between state and local courts and ERA program administrators as quickly as possible. So there's a couple of recommendations we have on how to do that. One is increasing communication efforts in courts. The state and local courts must act to ensure that both landlords and tenants know about ERA and have access to it. So things they can do are courts can modify their summons information to include information on emergency rental assistance. They can provide links and phone numbers on their website and ensure that people know how to apply and that those links are very visible in all stages of the court and eviction process. Second area is to implement data sharing between courts and ERA programs. It's very important right now to understand who is most at risk of eviction and where households are in the process of applying for assistance. We need to ensure that we can slow and stop evictions and prevent housing loss. So the courts and ERA programs should be working together to identify processes to find out and identify who might be in the queue for eviction and who might need connection to emergency rental assistance. Also starting to identify landlords who may have received emergency rental assistance and have been made whole and whose case may still be pending, and letting the courts know that so that eviction can be stopped. And then ensuring that those applications have a chance to be done in time. Third area is to, now that courts will be seeing more cases, is be present, either in person or virtually, depending on where your courts are, and keeping public safety at your own and public safety in mind, but being there to see where information is needed, to talk to landlords, to apply, to allow applications to happen at court. So having a presence there to understand what's happening and to make sure that information is being shared. Once applications are done, ERA programs really need to develop a process to fast track applications, especially ones that are in the queue due to non-payment of rent and that are really going to be acted on quickly. Fast tracking applications that have been done through court navigators or through this new presence in court will be very, very important. In order to do this, we're also increasing staffing, using the administrative fees, and really creating the infrastructure to have the navigators on hand to be able to efficiently support applications, make sure they're complete, follow up on applications that might be pending that are incomplete, and really decrease processing times because the applications need to be processed quickly. The last thing I'll mention is that also programs can do in state and local communities can help support is really starting to coordinate with 211, your continuum of care, and your homelessness diversion programs. As folks may move into more precarious housing situations or may lose housing due to an unavoidable eviction, ensuring that you're working with your eviction prevention or your homelessness diversion programs and using that infrastructure to make sure people do not become homeless is extremely important, and allowing using funds for rehousing when necessary and as needed. So like I said, we will talk a little bit more about some of the opportunities to create programs that can move faster a little bit later in the call. But we'll also, next slide, wanted to remind people that we are also hosting a webinar series over the next few, it started last week and we'll have our second one this week that focuses on creating accessible applications through ERA. And so please join us for that webinar on the 4th from 3 to 4:30, where we will be talking about how to ensure that people with disabilities have access to ERA. Hear from Erin from Texas HoUSed again, who's on the call today, as well as some programs that have been very successful about creating efficient, low barrier applications and getting funds out to those who need them most. So thank you so much. I will hand it back over to Sarah and Renee.
All right, so thank you, Sarah. Sarah, do you have any other updates before we move into questions?
I do, but it might be good to ask questions about the eviction moratorium, and then I can move on to the other stuff.
That's perfect, absolutely. So we do have a number of questions that have come in, a number of really, really good questions. The first one is there a way to send a letter condemning the members of Congress that left for vacation and the Biden administration in the strongest of terms for failing to extend the federal moratorium and demand to immediately reverse action?
Ooh, that's a really good question. And I think we spent a lot of time trying to engage with those folks who we thought were wishy-washy on the legislation to extend the moratorium. Ultimately, we don't have a definitive list of those members who were no votes. This is sort of just what we've been able to gather through the grapevine about about where people were in terms of whipping folks. The hard part is that, those House members, it was super disappointing that they didn't vote to support the moratorium. But at the same time, we also know that even if it passed the House, we were going to face a huge uphill battle in the Senate where Senate Republicans were not going to let this move forward. So I think from this point forward, it really makes sense to mostly focus on what are those things that the federal government can do and what can state and local governments do. Even though we know that a federal eviction moratorium was certainly needed, and it was very disappointing that we weren't able to get it at either the presidential level or the congressional level. And I'll also say that the president didn't extend the moratorium. Again, deeply disappointing given the spread of the Delta virus and the impact on renters. But we also recognize that threat from the Supreme Court is a very real threat. And there's really no assurances that if the president had extended that moratorium, it could have been overturned in just a couple of days, also leaving renters without protections. And so it's all around a really terrible situation and not a ton of great options at this point.
Thank you, Sarah. We have another question. Is there a list of members who refuse to support an extension?
Yeah, we actually don't have a list of those members. We're sort of trying to gather it through different channels of members of Congress who we have relationships with. We heard it's about 12 to 14 members, and that there was mostly moderate Democrats, but we don't have a list of who voted against. That's usually a closed process where Democratic leadership will reach out to their caucus to see where the support is and where it's not, but they don't make that information publicly available.
Thanks. Another question. Another Sarah wants to know what city was mentioned on the last White House Eviction Summit as sending checks within 48 hours? And is there a recording of the summit?
Ooh, I do not know. Maybe Sarah G knows that example. I don't remember. And I know some portions of the Eviction Summit were recorded, but other parts weren't. Other parts were closed door. Sarah, do you know?
I'm racking my brain. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but we will look into it and try to get it into the chat before the end of the call.
Yeah, that sounds great, Sarah. Thank you. Here's another question. Any conversations from HUD on relaxing some of their requirements to get CDBG CV funds out faster?
That's a good question too, and I don't know the answer. I'm going to talk to Ed on our team and reach out and follow back up with that person who asked the question.
Excellent. And also too, just in the chat, the chat is great. I hope everyone is kind of following along. But we have one comment in the chat that says the legal issues presented by the federal eviction moratorium, which were cited by the Biden White House based on a US Supreme Court ruling recently, do not apply to state or local eviction moratoria. The adoption of such state and local eviction moratoria should therefore go forward wherever possible, wherever it's politically possible. And on that note, we have a question that came in that says, how do we call on local authorities to enact eviction moratoriums?
I can step in there, Sarah, and then you can jump in if you want.
Sure.
So yeah, I think that's a great point that the author of that question made. Yeah, there's really limited authority at the federal level to issue a moratorium. The hook that the CDC used was its public health statute. But as we mentioned before, the Supreme Court was sort of indicating that they would find that to be an invalid use of that statute. So we're always risking that. But state and local governments have enormous flexibility when it comes to passing their own eviction moratorium. And so it's really important for all of you to be engaging with not just your federal policymakers, but your state and local ones as well, because that can go a long way, especially if it's the same state government that is having trouble distributing their own emergency rental assistance dollars. They can pair those moratoriums and have a time frame that matches when they think they're going to actually be able to get those ERA funds out the door.
Great, thank you, Sarah.
Okay, and I just add, you want to talk to your state legislature about that as well. They can be really great partners in that, and many states are starting to put those in action. I think we just found out Georgia, DeKalb County has extended theirs, so we're very excited about that.
Great. And here's another question. Is the hiring of additional staff an allowable use of funds under ARP? And then it says, there's a comment, here in Nevada, we are hearing that the pace of payouts is slow because there's not enough staff to process applications.
Yeah, so both ERA 1 and ERA 2 allow funding for staff under the housing app for housing supports as well as administration. So you can look at both of those, and depending on if it's ERA 1, it could be 10% or 15% of the allocation. So there is allowable costs for staff, and we're recommending that, highly recommending that programs take advantage of that to build the infrastructure for the programs to move quickly.
Great, thank you, Sarah. All right, so let's move on. Let's transition to the next topic, which is advancing long-term housing solutions in the infrastructure spending bill. Sarah, it's your turn yet again.
Okay, great. I'll start with the infrastructure bill. So over the weekend, a group of bipartisan senators who have been negotiating this infrastructure deal announced that they had reached a more concrete plan for legislation, around $550 billion in new spending. And over the weekend, they worked to finalize the text of that agreement. It looks like that is poised to move forward relatively quickly in the Senate. There was a procedural vote last Friday. It passed 66-28. That's a really good sign that this measure is going to have enough support to move out of the Senate. Once the Senate passes this bipartisan infrastructure bill, they will immediately turn their attention to the budget resolution, which is the first step in the process to pass a budget reconciliation bill, which would include the much broader ask that Democrats are pushing for, including housing investments. Senator Schumer said over the weekend that that two-track system is moving forward. They are on schedule, and the goal is to pass both the bipartisan bill and that budget resolution before they recess for the August recess at the end of the week. There are two things that I'm looking for in this budget resolution or the process of that budget resolution being enacted. One is, what is the allocation for housing? It might be a little complicated to figure that out when the budget resolution is released. We're going to be looking for what is the allocation that's for the banking committee. We know that the banking committee has some programs that are housing programs, but other programs outside of housing, I believe transportation programs. So the total overall number might be bigger, but it includes things other than housing. So we're going to be trying to distill down how much information we can get about the housing allocation. The second thing we're going to be paying a lot of attention to is amendments that might be filed and voted on for that budget resolution when it's going through the Senate. The process of passing a budget resolution is relatively time consuming. They have to go through many hours of debate and then a process that's called vote-a-rama, where members of Congress can bring up a huge number of amendments to get voted on. What's important here is we certainly expect many offices to raise up very harmful amendments. But because the budget resolution itself is not binding legislation, none of those amendments are binding either. It's really, this is just like a political thing where folks use this process to push their political opponents to take tough votes. But it's still really not awesome to have members introduce amendments that are harmful or against our message. Expect to see things around limiting access for people who are undocumented or recapturing unspent dollars. I'm sure that will be part of the conversation, and we'll want to push back on those harmful amendments, even if they're not binding, if they were to get approved. In terms of where it goes we're starting to see more fractures within House Democrats again around this infrastructure plan. I've spoken before about how Speaker Pelosi has said that she's not going to move forward with a bipartisan bill when it comes out of the Senate until they can also move forward with the budget reconciliation process for the larger infrastructure and economic recovery bill. We're now hearing from moderate Democrats who are threatening not to vote for a budget resolution if the House doesn't take up the bipartisan bill. At least half a dozen moderate Democrats have expressed their reservations about that. And really the House can only afford to lose 3 Democrats and still get it through. And so you're starting to see those tensions sort of play out. Regardless, it's really important that we are focused on the House campaign's top priorities for any infrastructure bill, which is expanding rental assistance to everyone who's eligible, at $70 billion to preserve public housing, and at least $45 billion for the Housing Trust Fund. These conversations are continuing to play out. And so, and this is a really once in a generation opportunity to get major investments in housing. And so it's really important that we're continuing to engage with our members of Congress. And one of the best ways that you can do that is also to ask your members of Congress to co-sponsor the Housing is Infrastructure Act, or HR 4497, or the Ending Homelessness Act, HR 4496, both of which have been introduced by Chairwoman Maxine Waters. We've been working really hard to build up the co-sponsor list for both of those bills. They stand at about 50 co-sponsors so far. But we really want to use this moment to coalesce Democrats around this proposal and make the biggest push that we can for it. So that's where things are with infrastructure. We're going to see a lot of activity this week. So next week, we'll be able to report back, hopefully, to find out how much of an allocation housing gets in this package. In terms of appropriations, I just did want to briefly mention that. I'll pause there just to reiterate those bill numbers because I see a question about that in the chat box. That's the Housing is Infrastructure Act, which is HR 4497, and the Ending Homelessness Act, which is HR 4496. Okay, moving on to appropriations. Last week, the House voted to approve its collection of spending bills, including the bill for housing and urban development. It substantially increases funding for housing in the FY22 budget. It's about $6.8 billion above last year's funding and would increase rental assistance by 125,000 households and provide increases to virtually all programs at HUD. So that's just on the House side. We're likely to see the Senate to begin their work starting next week. They're not starting with the housing provisions yet. We're going to keep an eye for on that. But we do hear that the Senate is going to start to take up their process now and then continue it in September. Because of the delay on the Senate side, especially, we're expecting a short-term CR or continuing resolution to keep the government open for when the new fiscal year starts. At least a short-term CR. Some talk about maybe one that's longer term to December or even later. We think a longer-term CR is a really bad idea, in part because CRs only carry over funding levels from the year prior. And that means there wouldn't be an opportunity to increase funding for housing programs, which is badly needed. So we're continuing to engage with members of Congress about the need to pass final spending bills and to ensure that housing gets the highest amount of resources possible. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Renee.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So it looks like we had a few questions to come in. However, staff is working really hard to answer those questions. So in the interest of time, we're going to actually move to our next speaker. But thank you so very much, Sarah, for those very, very important updates. So now I want to bring to the conversation Tim Thomas, who is a PhD from UC Berkeley. Tim is the research director for the Urban Displacement Project and will be sharing the housing precarity risk model he and his team have developed. Hi, Tim. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Rini. Thank you so much for having me, and just very excited to be part of this conversation. I just wanted to share real quickly a new project that we just released that we've been working on for the past year called the Housing Precarity Risk Model in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. As we all know, there's a lot of precarity or precarious households in different neighborhoods preceding the pandemic, that all the conditions they face were exacerbated because of the pandemic itself. So we spent over a year developing a model based on a lot of research we've done in the past and research from many other scholars and stakeholders and feedback from local communities about this need to understand where is vulnerability. And the housing precarity risk model is basically a national vulnerability map that's trying to forecast where displacement, eviction, and long-term poverty may be amplified after the moratoriums lift. We built this tool to help agencies direct resources to vulnerable communities locally. Largely what we did is our analysis covers metropolitan areas with over 1 million people, and we're intending to expand this analysis over the next coming months and also on through the next few years as more data comes available, and also trying to improve it, look at more smaller areas as well. But for now, we had to limit our analysis to 53 metros with over 1 million people. We released this on June 28th with the anticipation of the first moratorium lift, which didn't happen. But we felt it was necessary to push this out as soon as possible, even though these maps are conservative estimates requiring local engagement to understand the risks of community, the risks of who is going to be displaced, what areas are really in need. And we've also opened up a form so that for anyone that is interested could provide feedback on their local area so it can help us improve the model. Kim Johnson put in a link to the website in the chat, so please feel free to kind of pour through this and reach out at any point if you have any questions. So what is housing precarity? We define it as household resilience to economic and environmental shocks. And we measure it by looking at pre-pandemic displacement risk and pre-pandemic eviction risk based on multiple data sets across over a couple dozen areas. We applied a very advanced model to try and understand what are the dynamics in a neighborhood that are related to the risk of eviction. We put that into this model. We also looked at where low-income households are located, where displacement has been going on. And we also interacted all this with unemployment from 2020. And so every metropolitan area, basically a tract gets a score from 0 to 9. So to kind of, summarize what these tracts show, you can click on a tract, you can see a lot of demographic information about an area. You can look at how we developed this, but basically, depending on the levels of displacement prior to the pandemic in 2019, plus the level of eviction risk in 2019 interacted with 2020 unemployment rates, we produced this 0 to 9 HPRM score. Now, across the nation, what we've seen is there's just a lot of precarity. We see that 41% of all households, that's homeowners and renters, live in moderate to high eviction or displacement risk neighborhoods across our 53 metros. Renters are particularly vulnerable. 52% of all renters across our study areas live in moderate to high eviction or displacement risk areas. And there's this huge issue where precarity is falling across racial lines, where 73% of all Black renters live in high eviction or displacement risk neighborhoods across the 53 metros. So we were able to identify the top 10 most precarious metros based on different dynamics. This list is here. At the very top is Las Vegas. That's largely because there was such a huge impact of unemployment with the service industry there. Second is New Orleans, which has similarly, tourism and service industry was impacted with unemployment, but there's a huge level of segregation also in those areas that was related to our statistical models. Detroit also has high levels of segregation, which contributed a lot to the issue of precarity. Providence, Rhode Island, Buffalo, Memphis was number 6. Memphis is actually the number 1 at risk of eviction, which put it at the top of the precarity list. But Memphis is an interesting situation, and this is something we want to highlight at how these models are conservative. Statistics can kind of only get you so far. And what we found is that Memphis actually has had a very low level. Well, what I've heard, and I would appreciate some confirmation, is that it's had a very low level number of pandemic evictions, and hopefully post-moratorium evictions are going to be very low because depending on how local groups are operating and trying to protect tenants there. So even though these models basically are conservative and they produce kind of an estimate of risk, it's important to also engage with local community stakeholders, CBOs, advocates, to really get a true understanding of what's going on. We hope to improve this model so that it incorporates these different dynamics, particularly like policies in place. For example, in San Francisco and Oakland have some of the strongest tenant protection policies during the pandemic. They only had about 25 lockouts from sheriff lockouts. However, just south, the county that San Jose is located in had over 200. So 25 versus 200 is a huge disparity, which means that the local protections and policies had a very powerful impact, as well as the stakeholder engagement in trying to protect people and keep them housed. Rounding out the top 10, Cleveland, Philadelphia, New York, and Los Angeles there too. I'll keep this very brief, but basically, we want to extend this map. We plan to have a report out hopefully later today that kind of describes this process and the stage. And like I said, we'll be continuing to work on this throughout time, and I'll just kind of hand this over back to Rini. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Tim. Really do appreciate your work. Really great comprehensive work. And as Tim mentioned earlier, and I think Kim from the coalition put a link to the risk model in the chat. So please do take a look at the research and the information that Tim and his team has provided. It looks like do we have a question? One just came in, let's see. Okay, so what I'll ask Tim, because I'm sure that folks will have questions as we go along. So if you have time to stay on with us to perhaps answer those questions, we really would appreciate it. So thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. Indeed.
All right, so we're going to transition now into our field updates. So we're going to hear from our partners in the field from Texas, Wisconsin, and Puerto Rico. And first, I'm going to turn it over to Aaron Hahn, who is a research analyst at Texas HoUSed. And Aaron will be given an update on eviction happenings in Texas and also ERA. Aaron, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Renee. Hi, everyone. My name is Erin Hahn, and like Renee said, I'm a research analyst with the housing nonprofit group Texas HoUSed. Thanks to the NLIHC for having me on today to give a field update on the status of ERA and evictions in the state of Texas on this Monday following the expiration of the CDC moratorium. And so Texas HoUSed, like housing groups across the nation, are bracing themselves for a wave of evictions in our state. We do not have a statewide moratorium in Texas, and the majority of our cities don't have local moratoria in place either. So eviction court dockets for this upcoming week appear to already be filling up with many more cases than what was normal under the CDC moratorium, according to observations we've made in our Harris County Eviction Court Watch program. As for a general update for the distribution of emergency rental assistance in Texas, according to the most recent Treasury data from June 30th, the statewide Texas Rent Relief Program had dispersed about 34% of its ERA1 allocation, but that percentage has increased to 47% as of today, according to the program's public-facing dashboard. On the other hand, the performance of our local city and county programs, which there's 36 of across the state, is pretty mixed. They're more difficult to track since for the most part, they don't have dashboards like our statewide program. But according to Treasury's June 30th data, the average local ERA program in Texas had dispersed 19% of its ERA1 funds to households. 10 of the 36 jurisdictions had not begun to disperse any funds. These are mostly programs in smaller or more rural jurisdictions, but some of our major cities like Houston, Austin, and San Antonio, which had dispersed 70, 77, and 77% of their funds respectively, are operating more quickly. And eviction rates across the state vary depending on whether there's a local moratorium in place. For example, according to the Legal Services Corporation's eviction tracker, there have been about 35,000 evictions filed since the start of the pandemic in Harris County or the Houston area, which does not have a local moratorium, but just a little over 1,000 in Travis County, the Austin area, where there is a local moratorium intact. I have two pieces of statewide news to share. First, the Supreme Court of Texas extended the Texas Eviction Diversion program, which was originally set to expire on July 27th through October 1st. And so with $171 million in CARES Act funding, the program offers an alternative to eviction if both the tenant and the landlord agreed to participate, and provides up to 15 months of rental and utility assistance. So this is some good news. And second, the Supreme Court of Texas also released an emergency order about 2 weeks ago that mandates that judges must abate for 60 days eviction cases in which either the plaintiff has a pending application for rental assistance, or if the plaintiff and defendant both express interest in participating in the Texas Eviction Diversion program. And so at Texas HoUSed, we were excited to hear about this because our Harris County court watchers have seen many tenants with pending applications for assistance be evicted before their application has been given sufficient time to be approved, given long program wait times. And so the past couple of weeks, we've been putting up pressure on the courts to make sure they abide by this emergency order and abate these cases by the full 60 days. So in summary, the state of Texas appears to be distributing ERA funds at a comparatively high rate in relation to other states. But based on our direct work with tenants who have waited months to be approved for assistance and what we're seeing in the courtroom, we don't believe it's operating fast enough to prevent a wave of evictions from occurring in the coming weeks with the lifting of the CDC moratorium. And although the extension of the Texas Eviction Diversion program and the recent emergency order are steps in the right direction for the state of Texas, they're not enough to offer complete protection against eviction. So we're really hoping to see local jurisdictions step up to the plate and take action to keep people housed in their own communities. That is it for me. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Erin. We do have one question that came in for you, Erin. Well, the question is, do you have a sense of what separates those local areas spending quickly from those spending less?
Yes, Texas HoUSed actually just released a couple weeks ago a report that evaluates the progress of local ERA programs in Texas. I can drop a link to that in the chat after this, but there's definitely something to say about streamlining applications. And so we compared programs that, for instance, the city of Arlington had multiple documents that were required. I think it was like 13. And then San Antonio provided a list of just a range of documents and allowed for self-attestation. And so I'll be speaking on the Erase webinar on Wednesday about streamlining applications for some more strategies for how to do that to get the funds out quickly.
That's great. Thank you, Erin. And if you also can stay around, there may be other questions that come through. If you could answer those, that would be fantastic. But thank you so much for sharing all of that great information with us, Erin. So I'm going to turn it over now to our next speaker, who will give us an update on what's happening in Wisconsin. So we have Deborah Hefner of Community Advocates and Christy Lazur with Urban Economic Development Association of Wisconsin, Inc. So Christy and Deborah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Renee. If you could go to the next slide. So we appreciate the opportunity to talk about the Milwaukee Rental Housing Resource Center, an initiative that launched in 2020 after a couple of years of really great work with stakeholders in Milwaukee after the book Evicted came out and really highlighted the eviction issue in our city. And so this center has really become a place for us to really work together collaboratively and particularly focus on getting the rental resources out, as well as legal and mediation services. So that work in 2018 to 2019 resulted in 4 recommendations, one was to create a new tenant landlord resource center to serve as a front door for eviction prevention services. And this is something that we had not previously had in our community in Milwaukee today. So we worked really hard to put that together and then also expand awareness of mediation and legal services. And another focus was expand capacity of rent assistance, which at the time we thought would be really challenging. But as we all know, in the last year, there is so much more of that money available, which has actually really helped further a lot of our work. Next slide, please. So Deb and I are going to talk a little bit today, just a few minutes about the work we're doing. You see here we have 9 co-partner agencies, and these are the core of your eviction prevention intervention services in our community. And they have been involved for since 2019, really. And in 2020, the pandemic really accelerated our efforts to support struggling tenants and landlords and move millions of dollars of rent assistance funds out the door. And so we had the benefit of nearly 2 years of work together to really come together quickly and respond to these immediate impacts. Next slide, please. So you'll see here a description of each of the groups, and this is actually really helpful because it gives you a sense of the different constituencies involved. And in previous conversations, people were talking about making sure you're connected to your homeless prevention services and legal and mediation. And you see all of those groups represented here, as well as local government. And so this has really been critical to the success where we can really just think about the housing system and the rental housing issues that are really faced by people every day. We have an advisory committee for the center that also has broader representation from other sectors, so the courts, the housing authority, funders, et cetera. But we really have the core groups that are impacted every day by this work. And so this is a groundbreaking collaboration in our community because of these partners. We have inclusion of the Landlord Association, which really helps us address the bigger picture of rental housing, but then also close coordination between social service providers and legal and mediation services. And so Deb is going to talk about what we've been doing, the results so far, and what we've learned.
All right, thank you. So as Christy mentioned, the Rental Housing Resource Center has really accelerated throughout the pandemic. And I always say, as a provider of rent assistance in Milwaukee County, how grateful we've been because it's really helped us and served as a vehicle to be able to get out the rent assistance and then also work on those broader eviction diversion strategies. So, streamlined intake, cross-sector collaboration, and engaging both tenants and landlords is really the solutions that we've been working to build. In December, we launched our Rent Help email, hotline, and website, and we built a triage team to be able to respond to those platforms. So the triage team is making direct referrals to landlords and tenants and making sure that they have the information and get to the right provider. And just that opportunity to be able to truly assess what someone needs, because often we're finding that, even if they're calling specifically for rent assistance, which is so many of the calls that we get, and we've had, over 20,000 calls since we launched the center, there's often a need to also involve those other partners. And then again, these solutions have also helped us to be able to administer rent assistance. So we have 2 providers in Milwaukee. Community Advocates is administering the Milwaukee County, and then we have a partner, SDC, that's working on the city of Milwaukee. We, in the state of Wisconsin, we currently do not have a statewide eviction moratorium protection. We did in April and May of 2020. It does not look like that's going to be politically viable in the near future. So instead, we've really been working on other tactics. So a lot of that includes outreach with landlords. And so there again, the Apartment Association of Southeastern Wisconsin has been very instrumental in this, helping us with messaging. All along the way, they promoting the center as a more cost and time effective way, to go about collecting rental arrears, and even just solving broader housing challenges as well. Another area is work that we've done with the courts, and that really also includes the Apartment Association. But we've been meeting regularly, and really we now have a consultant working on a facilitated process to be able to really pick what efforts we're going to be working on moving forward. The right to counsel did pass in Milwaukee County in June of 2020, and that group also served as a great platform to be able to, in the passing itself, but also, just the planning to move it forward and link the center to that process. So next slide, please. So lessons learned, really just the crucialness of rental assistance. And it's always been important to housing stability, but it's imperative now, and having these partners already in place working together has been instrumental. Also, in Milwaukee County, we did expend the original direct allocation that the county received. And the county has done a wonderful job at working with the state of Wisconsin Department of Administration that's overseeing rental assistance in other counties to be able to deploy additional dollars to Milwaukee County. And so that's another success and lesson learned, and really as a vehicle through the center has been made possible. And then just how critical these partnerships are, and just the continuous communication and working together. And while we know there's a lot of work ahead, all the partners are at the table, and we're committed to, to doing whatever it takes to keep as many people stably housed as possible. And then last slide, please. I mentioned our platform, so here's just a link to our website, and then our social media handles as well, and our email and phone number.
I posted the website in the chat, and I do see a question. And thank you, Ryan Peters. I know I just saw your comment, but it's actually both a virtual and physical, and there is a physical space. So Deb and Community Advocates host that. We actually just really opened that up in the last 2 months. And UWIDA, our organization, is a facilitator and association that does other housing collaborative work. We were asked to help facilitate this group in 2019 and move the recommendations forward. So that is the communication and info sharing that's served by our organization. But the goal eventually is to actually build that into the collaborative itself, so other co-partners are doing that together. So it's not a separate organization, it's a collaborative initiative with these cross-sector partners.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing the information. And as Christy mentioned, she did drop a link to all of their great resources in the chat. So please do check it out. And we have a question. It looks like that came in. It says, since the Social Development Commission is doing ERA in the city of Milwaukee, why aren't they on this great team?
I'll answer that. They actually were asked to provide that early on with CARES Act, but are more of a social services and wraparound services agency. And so they really just stepped up to really provide that additional service, and Deb can speak to that. So we had 2 agencies that folks could go to, but have indicated that's not really what they do. Like, they do these other programs and services. They are our community action agency and do anti-poverty work. So the real goal is that as we move on and the rent assistance funds go away, they will actually continue to be a part of it as one of our service providers that we connect to through a referral network that our impact is helping to build. So Deb, I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, no, they've done participating, we've done bi-weekly calls all along. And so they're like a very close sister or brother to the Rental Housing Resource Center, a part of these conversations. And then of course, there's continuous communication between community advocates and SDC, and also data sharing as well, just to make sure that we're aware of who's in the applicant and approval pools.
Right.
Fantastic. Thank you so very much for sharing the work that you're doing. We really do appreciate it. And if you can also stick around, we may have a few more questions that may come in before we close out the session. So thank you both. So we're now going to turn it over, actually our next field speaker, Ariadna Goduru Obear, and I do apologize for mispronouncing your name. I know we talked about your first name earlier. It's completely beautiful. But Ariadna is the founder and executive director for Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico, Inc. And she'll be speaking with us today on PC 488, which prohibits evictions and foreclosures during the periods of disaster. She'll also be speaking about ERA disbursement and other advocacy efforts that they're doing at Ayuda Legal.
So thank you all for the space. Now moving forward, now that the moratorium is over in Puerto Rico, we wanted to share with you a little bit about what has been our experience with Project 429. Back in January, we decided to present our first bill. Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico is a nonprofit that is a non-LSC, so we have been working for a while with tenants' rights and people undergoing eviction processes and disaster survivors. And we decided to present a bill that could tie up the needs, the housing needs of those three populations. And we presented Project 429, which basically acknowledges the right to housing at moments of disasters. This would be the first bill in Puerto Rico that properly speaks about about housing as a human right. Also, this bill states evictions and foreclosures up to a maximum of 90 days after a disaster or during the duration of an emergency. The project also offers a moratorium on the payment of rental fees or mortgage payments during this same period. If signed by Governor Pierluisi, these measures would be available to people who suffer adverse economic consequences of disasters. For example, those who lost their jobs because of the pandemic, or those who see their income decrease as a result of a hurricane or an earthquake. By the end of last session in June, we were able to gather multi-partisan support to the bill. It was approved by both chambers, and now we are in the process of having Governor Pierluisi sign it. We, of course, had the opposition of landlord associations and also from the financial institutions, including co-ops. Right now, we are expecting the legislature to send the bill once the new session starts. That will be August 16. And Governor Pierluisi will have 10 days either to veto the bill, stating his reasons, or to finally sign the bill and make it a law. This is particularly important in Puerto Rico, where, as you probably know by now, tenants' rights organizations, tenant rights association are not common. I would say that there are only like a few, less than 3 tenants' rights organizations in Puerto Rico. And at the same time, it's a place where renters' rights have been more and more eroded because of speculation and because of huge higher rents after Hurricane Maria hit the island. We are very positive about the signature of the governor. We are also near the peak of the hurricane season, so this is also like another reason for this to happen. If this project goes through, it would apply to future disasters, including hurricane, earthquakes, future pandemics, and whatnot. And it would be like a great model for other jurisdictions, not only in the US, but elsewhere, to start speaking about the right to housing at moments of disasters. Also, Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico, we finally got the governor and the government of Puerto Rico to talk about ERA. And not only that, but they actually published the guidelines, and the program is now open. We haven't heard of a lot of publicity about the existence of the program, but that's something that we have been working with organizations and with communities on the ground. Also, I wanted to use this space to announce that Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico, we will be launching a program to provide representation and court navigators for people undergoing eviction processes in Puerto Rico. Right now, what we are seeing is that all of the hearings, and this is something that is being like that is happening everywhere else, are being scheduled for the next 2 weeks. So we hope to have pro bono attorneys and staff attorneys ready to defend people at risk of losing their houses. I hope that's helpful.
Yes, it's extremely helpful. Thank you so much for that important update. I don't see any questions for you just yet, but we may have some to roll in. So if you can answer them as they come in, that would be fantastic. So let's now turn to the coalition. We have some important updates from Sarah Gallagher, who is the project director of Erase. You saw her a little bit earlier today. And then we also have Rebecca Ye, who is the coalition senior research analyst. And we also have Emma Foley, who is our research analyst, with some important updates. The floor is yours.
Great, and I'm going to hand it over directly to Rebecca because I gave my updates earlier, or to Emma because I gave my updates earlier.
Thanks, Sarah. Next slide. So first, we just wanted to start off with an update on ERA spending progress overall. As we've been saying for a couple weeks now, ERA spending has been ramping up, but given the expiration of the federal eviction moratorium, it is not ramping up fast enough. NLIHC has compiled data from several different sources, including the Department of Treasury, ERA program dashboards, news articles, and communications with our partners to track overall ERA spending. We update this data weekly, and in a few slides, I'll share some information about where it can be found publicly in the future. But right now we're tracking that at least $3.6 billion has been spent out of a total of $24.6 billion that we are tracking. This doesn't include data for tribal allocations or for several programs that haven't opened yet, which is why it's not a total of 25 billion. As we've noted before, states are spending down funding significantly slower than localities, which is concerning as they have the bulk of the funding. As you can see here, states have a total of 18 billion out of the total 25 billion. And states have distributed approximately 14.4% of their funds, whereas localities have spent approximately 23%. Next slide. So I know that this slide is pretty data heavy, but it just provides a snapshot of how each of the state level ERA programs are doing, so you can see progress in your state. We will send these slides out after the call so you can compare across states as well. As a note, some of these data are more recent than others because we use the most updated data available from a variety of data sources. As you can see, some state ERA programs have made a lot of progress, including Virginia, which has spent around 47% of its allocation, and Texas, which has spent around 55%, as well as Alaska, the District of Columbia, Illinois, and Maine, all of which have spent more than a quarter of their funding. Other states have spent next to nothing, including several states with a high number of low-income renter households. This includes New York, South Carolina, and Florida. In just a minute, my colleague Rebecca Ye will talk about program features and flexibilities that can increase spending. And many of the most successful programs have implemented these critical features and flexibilities. Next slide. And then just as a final note on how progress looks over time, this is according to the most recent Treasury data release on June 30th. And as you can see from the cumulative line, the amount of ERA funding paid out to households has nearly doubled each reporting period, increasing from 256 million in Q1, which was January through March, to 464 million in April, to 766 million in May, and then finally to 1.5 billion in June alone. The number of households served has also been steadily increasing, with over 84,000 households served in Q1 and almost 300,000 households served in June. Since the ERA program started, 633,000 unique households have been served. Again, we'll say, as you can see, the spending is increasing from month to month, but obviously this is not fast enough. Next slide. And then shortly in the next week or so, we will be publishing some of this data, making it available on the Coalition's Emergency Rental Assistance Dashboard, which is linked here. We will be sure to feature this on a future call once these updates are live. And now I'm going to pass it over to Rebecca Yeh to discuss ERA best practices and to provide a refresher just on the resources available through the Coalition to locate ERA programs and inform ERA programs.
Thanks, Emma. Hi, everybody. There are a couple of best practices that program administrators can use to make their programs more effective. So first, programs should allow tenants to self-attest to eligibility requirements such as income, COVID hardship, housing instability, and lease. Programs also need to allow direct-to-tenant assistance. This will really help ensure that tenants with non-responsive or uncooperative landlords can still get the help that they need. Programs can also use eligibility to other income qualified programs such as SNAP, TANF, WIC, or LIHEAP to verify income, or use fact-specific proxies such as data indicating average income in the household's geographic area to verify income and decrease burden on tenants. These three tactics will really help to make sure that programs are more accessible and less burdensome to tenants, and also reduce administrative burden for program staff, and will help to speed up the application processing on the back end. Programs should also be enacting program policies and procedures to support tenants that are at risk of eviction and or have already faced eviction. So ERA programs can integrate housing stability services into their programs, including eviction prevention, legal aid, and housing navigator services. These services would be extremely helpful for tenants at imminent risk of eviction. Administrators should also use emergency rental assistance for relocation assistance and forward rent, in addition to paying for arrears. So making sure that it's flexible to use it for all three of those circumstances, and using the funds for these different situations will help provide assistance to folks who live in precarious housing situations, have already been evicted, or are experiencing homelessness. Lastly, as part of the conditions set in their payment contracts with landlords, program administrators should include protections for renters from eviction due to non-payment of rent for 30 to 90 days after the landlord receives rental assistance. So altogether, these strategies can help programs more effectively serve tenants, to deliver assistance more efficiently, as well as to help tenants in a variety of situations. Then next slide, please, just to plug again, in case it's like helpful, if you're looking for an emergency rental assistance program near you, or want to get help get the word out in your neighborhood, check out our emergency rental assistance program locator at nlhc.org/rental-assistance. Next slide, please. You can also find out if your emergency rental assistance program is using best practices at our dashboard, and you can visit nlhc.org/ERA-dashboard. Next slide. Next slide, please. And lastly, if your ERA program is not using best practices, you can help connect them to best practices at our resource hub at nlhc.org/resource-hub. And I think that otherwise, I'm ready. If there are any questions, happy to take some.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And also thank you, Emma. And yes, we do have questions that came in. So someone has asked, could you provide the link for state ERA progress percentages? And is this readily available and updated on the website?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We'll be launching that probably sometime this week on the ERA dashboard, which has been linked in the chat. And so be sure to visit that link, and we will definitely provide an update once it is available.
Great, thank you, Emma. And another question, someone asked, does anyone have information on how to access these navigators and how can someone become one?
I'm not positive what the question is referring to. Let me just scroll back through the chat.
So we'll take a look at that question. It's actually, Emma, a question in the Q&A section that came in. But while you're looking at that, I'll move on to another question that came in. Someone has asked, can you elaborate more on what you meant by using fact-specific proxies to reduce documentation burdens?
Sure. So in the May guidance that came out from Treasury for kind of establishing some updated guidance around the ERA program, they also were talking about a fact-specific proxy. So meaning being able to use, for example, a person's neighborhood or geographic location to indicate that they are likely at or below a certain income level. So kind of using data to qualify people's income, but not necessarily needing documentation, kind of an easier way to verify income. And I can also give an example. I can pop an example into the chat from, I think the state of Virginia has recently implemented a fact-specific proxy, and that goes into some more nitty-gritty details if this person is curious.
That would be great, Rebecca. Thank you. Thanks for doing that. We also have a question that comes in from Catherine. Catherine wants to know, she said, I was told by our Department of Human Services that tenant payments will count as income for public benefit programs unless it's paid in a one-time lump sum, making it exempt. And this is a statutory requirement. Any guidance on this as we advocate for direct payments for low-income tenants?
So this would not, if this is a direct to tenant payment, this would not be considered part of the tenant's income. It is, however, considered part of a landlord's income if it's a payment to the landlord.
Thank you, Rebecca. And another question that comes from Shell. Do you have more information about possible Biden administration or Treasury guidance that state funds won't be clawed back if a best faith effort is made to comply with rules linked to distribution of funds?
I don't think we do. This is, I believe, something that we've been inquiring about in our letter to Treasury, but I don't think that we have any updates. I don't know if anybody else from the policy team has any updates around that.
Okay, thank you. What we'll do, because I don't know if we have someone from the policy team still on, we may, but we'll follow up with, on that question as well. It's a great question though. It looks like that may be the last question that we have time for at this point. Let me thank you, Emma, and thank you, Rebecca, for the great information that you shared. And there are some links. If you take a look at the chat, I believe that staff, they've put in some links to some of the information that you can check out on our website. So again, thank you, Rebecca and Emma, for the information. So today, we're going to actually close out today's call. We will post the recording of today's webinar on our website, so you can visit www.nlhc.org/HoUSed for more information. Also be on the lookout for an email from us with a link to this recording and to material that we've shared in the chat, and links to material that we shared in the chat. We do have a number of working groups that are scheduled to meet this week. That information will be in the email that you'll receive as well. But I do want to mention we have a webinar scheduled for this evening, which is Tenant Talk Live. Tenant Talk Live is a webinar with and for residents and resident leaders. And so it will be today, August the 2nd at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. And let me drop a link to that in the chat if you want to register for that webinar. That again starts today, August the 2nd at 6 p.m. Eastern. And we'll be discussing the intersection of housing and the justice system on that call today. So hopefully you can join and have residents that you know and tenants and renters that you know to join as well. Thank you so much for joining us on today's call. We will see you next week, and have a wonderful rest of the day.